In Muslim society, paintings were not made to be hung on the wall, but to illustrate books, and for this reason we call them miniature paintings. This page, for example, there's a lot happening in it, a lot of detail, but the page itself is only 9 inches high. Illuminated and illustrated books were considered works of high art in the Islamic world, but as I discuss in the calligraphy art spot, the most important was the Quran, which could be magnificently ornamented. A Quran might open or end with a lavishly decorative frontispiece or finisspiece, 2 pages that faced and mirrored each other, embellished with gold illumination and colored inks. Ornament and calligraphy were separate areas of expertise, and so different artists would work on the same manuscript. In this 14th century Egyptian Quran, the ornament is dominated by a 12-point starburst in gold. The geometrical figure is set within a rectangle of rose-colored florets that frames each page, and then within an outer frame that surrounds both pages. Kufic script, angular lettering with strong vertical and horizontal strokes, is written in white at the top and bottom of the pages. Qurans and other books might be boxed as loose sheets or bound in leather. The bindings often had an extra flap, like the flap of an envelope, that protected the outer edges of the pages. While we usually think about paper when we talk about Islamic books, paper, which was made from cellulose, a plant and wood fiber, was a relatively new medium. Earlier, the older materials used for bookmaking were papyrus, also made from plant fiber, and parchment made from animal skins. Paper entered the Islamic world from China through Central Asia in the 8th century, and soon paper mills popped up all over from Iraq to Spain. Through that Iberian-Spanish conduit, Europeans learned to use and make paper in the 11th and 12th centuries. Paper was inexpensive compared to parchment, but because it was often made from recycled materials like old linen rags, there was sometimes anxiety about whether it was pure enough to use for Qurans. Therefore, despite paper's wide availability, Qurans were not written on paper until the 14th century. This is an example of a Quran on paper. Before the adoption of paper, books were considered luxury items. But because paper lowered the cost of production, it made it possible for all kinds of books, documents, even letters, an example of which you see here, to circulate widely in the Islamic world. There was no barrier to so-called secular knowledge in Islam. The study of medicine, astronomy, and the natural sciences were all acceptable forms of scholarship, much of it inherited from classical sources, translated into Arabic, and in this way carried forward in history. The earliest illustrated manuscripts contain short stories, such as the maqamat, from which comes this illustration of a library. Look at how the books are stacked flat in the bookshelves or niches up above. Below, one man reads from an open book while the others listen and discuss. This experience of the book as a partly read and partly oral form of communication was the norm. In a world before print, before the mass duplication of written materials, books were often copied by a master dictating to his disciples. When the master oversaw the process in this way, he gave it his seal of approval, identifying the copy as an authorized transmission of the original text. A bookseller in 10th century Baghdad described how a book was copied. He said the author would dictate from memory or from his original manuscript, and the scribes would then read the copy back to the master, who could correct the text as necessary, sometimes even rewriting significant portions. It must have been exceedingly frustrating for the scribe when that happened. The Muslim Journey's website has a first-person account of that process. Copying books required time and patience, but patrons managed to amass very large book collections. Medieval authors tell us that the libraries of Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba had hundreds of thousands of volumes, all copied by hand. In addition to calligraphy, books could also be illustrated, as we know, with paintings. But because of the avoidance of images in religious settings, the arts of book illustration didn't emerge in the Islamic world really until the 11th century, and they didn't mature until the 13th. In other words, it was a relatively late developing art form. A popular early set of illustrated stories was the Kalila wa Dimna. Here, in a 15th century version, we see a scene of a battle between crows and owls. There is a small boxed panel of text at the top, and the remainder of the page is filled with a gnarled tree whose roots feed from a pool of blue water. What makes the scene visually exciting is the way the tree bursts out of the picture frame to the right, demanding our attention. The frame imposes its discipline on the picture. For example, the pool in the lower left is cropped by the frame, and there is a portion of the tree bough that is obscured by the text block. But the frame cannot fully contain the energy of that tree as it reaches upward. The playful treatment of the frame is also seen in later paintings. In a 16th century Persian manuscript called the Haft Aurang, or Seven Thrones, among the illustrations is a scene of Solomon, or Suleiman, seated with the Queen of Sheba, or Bilqis. Suleiman's face is framed by a golden flaming halo, which emphasizes him as the central character. He's also veiled to avoid representing his face and thus risking idolatry. Suleiman and Bilqis sit together on a terrace with an ornamental pool, the silver paint of which, sadly, has tarnished over the years, so it now looks gray. Behind them is a garden with a red demon, and in front, a winged angel. Both are references to Suleiman's authority over the creatures of heaven and earth. To the side, the walls of the palace have balconies. Although the central part of the picture has a rectangular frame, the palace seems to unfold on the left-hand edge, and it is this flap into which the figures enter the scene through an open doorway. Whereas much of the picture appears flat, above, a box-like balcony projects out into the margin three-dimensionally. Although there isn't much 3D perspective, space is suggested by overlapping, by placing people both in front of and behind the door, or in front of and behind the pavilion. Overhead, a few wisps of stylized clouds reveal the influence of Chinese painting. The manuscripts in which these paintings appear have been collected by museums around the world, but they were admired and collected in their own day as well. A painting from a copy of the Khamsa, meaning 5 poems, of Nizami, shows a romantic scene of the legendary Persian princess Shirin at the moment when she sees a portrait of her future beloved. She is shown in a meadow, reclining on a carpet, and from a rocky outcrop in the upper left flows a stream. The paired tree trunks that rise behind the text block suggest the future pairing of the two lovers. This manuscript was illustrated in Iran in the late 15th century, but by the start of the 17th century, it had been obtained by the Mughal rulers of India, who were also big fans of Persian painting. So this is an example of the exchange of art within the Muslim world. The Mughals acquired art from elsewhere, but they also patronized local talent, such as the artist of this painting. The scene represents the orange-robed emperor receiving his son and heir, who bows to touch his feet, a customary sign of respect. The magnificent setting is a raised balcony and a palace audience hall. The hall is made of white marble with colorful stone inlay, and carpets are laid on the floor, and a textile canopy is raised overhead. Below, the assembled members of the court observe the display of respect and affection. Now, this is a great example of how art doesn't always tell the full story. Although the scene seems cordial, in reality, the son hated his father and had staged a rebellion to overthrow him. But it was the grandson who commissioned the painting, and with sons of his own waiting impatiently in the sidelines, he probably wanted to portray a scene of proper filial loyalty and obedience. We've looked at illustrations that were made expressly for books, but painters also made small individual images that could be pasted in albums. The first albums were collections of calligraphy, but later it was popular to combine pictures and calligraphy, as we see in this 16th century Persian page. Because the scenes didn't necessarily relate to any story, there is no narratival content, the images were often individual studies, a portrait, or here, a primrose. There are a great many beautiful paintings from Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Mughal manuscripts. As we enjoy them, it's worth recalling their diminutive scale. The images were made for book manuscripts, held in the hand. The detail is tiny, sometimes painted with a brush with only 3 hairs. With their luminous colors and such fine detail, the works are exquisite and jewel-like. More information on manuscripts and painting from all over the Muslim world can be found in the art books listed in the Islamic Art Spots bibliography on the Muslim Journeys website.
Islamic Art Spots are a presentation of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Bridging Culture's bookshelf, Muslim Journeys, is a presentation of the National Endowment for the Humanities in cooperation with the American Library Association. Support for this program was provided by a grant from Carnegie Corporation of New York, with additional support for art and media components from the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. To further explore the Islamic Art Spots and the Bridging Culture's bookshelf, Muslim Journeys, visit the Muslim Journeys website